Let's start today's episode with a little test. It's a test taken from the wonderful book Nobody's Fool. Imagine I'm standing in front of you next to a large whiteboard. I draw a large circle on the whiteboard. Inside the circle, I draw a line cutting it in half. What have I drawn? Now, some of you might say it's a Pokeball. Some might say it's a world with an equator line. Maybe you think it's a flathead screw, but I guarantee that none of you think it's a bucket with its handle up when viewed from directly overhead. From many other vantage points, you'd easily tell that you were looking at a bucket, but from the overhead view, you just see too little information to know. This is what scammers and fraudsters do. They show something, share information, and we assume we're seeing or hearing the full story, when in reality, they're hiding something major from us. The majority of us fall for some sort of scam. 25% of Americans believe that humans have psychic powers. This isn't true. A team led by Richard Saunders identified hundreds of consequential world events over a period of more than 20 years. These included the explosion of the Columbia Space Shuttle, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the devastating fire at Notre Dame Cathedral, and of course the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And they found that none of these events were predicted by prominent psychics. If psychics could predict the future, they would have done so by now. But psychics target desperate individuals. What about trained experts? Surely they can't be fooled. Except they are. Art fraud, for example, is surprisingly common. The Musée Thérèse in Elne, France, has publicly admitted that over half of its artworks on its walls are fake. Some experts estimate that 20 to 50% of a museum's paintings are forgeries. One art historian determined that at least 20 and possibly all 21 of the paintings at the 2017 Ducal Palace exhibit in Italy were not real. Scams are commonplace. Forgery is everywhere. Fraudsters are incredibly effective. Today, I'm incredibly privileged to speak to one of the world's best-known researchers.
My name is Dan Simons. I'm a psychology professor at the University of Illinois.
Dan's had an incredible career researching human biases and what leads us to be deceived. And he's just published my favourite behavioural science book of the year, Nobody's Fool, co-authored with Christopher Chabris.
Nobody's Fool is a book about the reasons why we can be easily deceived. And there are lots of books out there on deception in other forms. And what struck us when we were working on Nobody's Fool was that even though we have all of these examples of cons and all of these examples of scams, and we experience them day to day, we experience deception in a common way, we don't seem to learn from all of these examples. People continue to get fooled by the same kinds of scams over and over again. And as a result of that, we started to take a look at what are the commonalities across all of these scams. Not what are the characteristics of the people who are doing them. We're not interested in that. We're interested in why is it that we as just regular people or as businesses are so easily fooled. And what we came to realize was that there are a set of sort of cognitive habits, ways of thought, things that we do that work great for us the vast majority of the time, but that can be hijacked to take advantage of us.
So let's dig into those cognitive habits that lead us all to be fooled. The first is consistency.
Consistency is one of the hooks we describe in the book. And a hook is a kind of information that we find especially appealing, in part because it's usually a good signal for understanding. If you can get the same result over and over again, you generally have to have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. If you reliably can make a forecast that does pretty well, that means you probably have a pretty good model of reality. You have a pretty good understanding of what's happening in the world. So consistency in general, if somebody truly has a good understanding, they're going to be pretty consistent in what they do, and that's usually a good thing. The problem is that we take the idea of something being consistent, and when we see consistency, we assume that there must be deep understanding behind it. And of course, scam artists know this. So by presenting something as consistent, they can make it appealing because we take that as a sign that they have great understanding. So take Bernie Madoff, for example. His Ponzi scheme was not the sort of classic outrageous Ponzi scheme where people promise 50% returns in 6 months, kind of like current crypto scams do. What Bernie Madoff did was radically different from that sort of classic Ponzi scheme. He promised to give essentially the same returns year after year with never a down year and almost never a down month, which, if you know anything about investing in the stock market, you can't beat something like the Treasury that gives that sort of stable, low-level return. You can't beat that by a lot without adding in volatility, without adding in noise. And you're going to have down years. You're going to have down months. But Madoff's appeal was this remarkable consistency over a 15-year period, a sure sign that there was something wrong. But when people see that sort of consistency, they instead see it as, oh, this is great. He really understands how to time the market. He really understands how to make investments that do better than everybody else can do. And they take it as a sign of deep understanding rather than a sign of fraud.
In his book, Dan explains a study that he and his colleagues ran to test if teams of investment managers could be fooled by Madoff's scam. The researchers showed the investors a graph that depicted Madoff's performance over the years prior to the scheme's collapse, compared with 3 other hedge funds and the market as a whole. All of the different funds were given fake names so the investment bankers wouldn't know they were looking at Madoff's chart. The researchers asked the investment managers which fund they would put their institution's money in. Naturally, Madoff's line was much, much smoother than the others. It went up consistently over time. Yet these professionals picked it ahead of the 3 other hedge funds. Not a single one picked a different hedge fund. Consistency was a powerful hook for them. Even though Madoff's impossible returns had been a major topic in their own industry just a few years earlier, they couldn't help but be attracted to his chart and his consistent returns. If someone promises surprisingly consistent returns, then we should question it. And if we see something that looks a bit too familiar, then perhaps we should question that too. That is what Elizabeth Bick does.
I think one of the most interesting cases in recent years of scientific misconduct applies not just for one paper or one case of misconduct, but across thousands. Elizabeth Bick is a forensic data scientist. She basically digs into papers to look for cases of misconduct. And the way she does that is looks at images, typically from microbiology, that are duplicated across papers or sometimes within the same paper. So people claim to be studying the same substance or claim to be studying different substances, but produce exactly the same graph, sometimes photoshopped. It's outright fraud. There's no other explanation for it other than fraud. When you duplicate an image and then twist some things around to try and hide the fact that you've duplicated it, there's nothing other than misconduct there. And she's identified many, many, many hundreds of papers. This might be the most common form of misconduct, where people are literally reusing the same images. And this has a long history. I think the most prominent example that I've seen comes from Shun, a superconductivity physicist, who had a remarkable record of publication. I mean, in a 2-year span, he had more papers in Nature and Science than entire physics departments at top universities. He was a superstar. People spent an estimated $100 million trying to replicate his findings because they were really important. He was a giant in the field. But it turns out if you look at all of his papers next to each other, put them side by side, the graphs were the same data, just duplicated with different scales sometimes. And it took years to figure this out because many, many labs, 100+ labs around the world were trying to replicate his work and failing. And it was only then that people took a look at it. So there are consequences to this sort of stuff too.
Elizabeth Bick noticed something that most of us miss: familiarity. She spotted duplicated graphs as being consistent and familiar. And this familiarity is another hook used by fraudsters to scam us.
So familiarity is a lot like consistency in that the vast majority of the time, if you're familiar with something, that's generally going to be a sign that it's good. If you have people you've known for a long time and you're familiar with them, you kind of know when they're leading you wrong and then you know when they're leading you right. You're probably not going to remain good friends with people who aren't trustworthy. So having somebody who's a friend who's familiar, that's generally going to be a sign that it's trustworthy. There's a principle that Gerd Gigerenzer identified called the recognition heuristic, that if you recognize something, then it's probably not a bad guess for, so if I ask you, who's most likely to win the Spanish soccer league this year? If you're an American, you probably don't know a whole lot about that. But it'd be a pretty good guess to say, well, I recognize Barcelona and I recognize Madrid. Those are big cities. Those would be pretty good guesses. And that recognition heuristic is going to work a lot of the time. Things that are familiar, that are quickly available, often are going to be a good guess. So it's efficient to use them. When we're familiar with something, we tend to be somewhat more trusting of it, often for good reasons. And of course, scammers know this. So repeating the same thing over and over again makes us accept it more, makes it more familiar, makes us like it more. Repeating a trivia statement and having us judge whether it's true or not, having repeated it, having seen it before, makes us think it's more likely to be true. Right? This is known as the illusory truth effect because, of course, the actual truth doesn't change just because we recognize it. But things we recognize, we tend to trust more.
Dan's just referenced one of his studies with Emma Henderson and Dale Barr. They asked 567 adults in the UK to read 64 statements about obscure facts that most people wouldn't know. Half of the facts were true. For example, the capital of Mauritius is Port Louis. Half were false. For example, the capital of Switzerland is Zurich. A day later, a week later, and a month later, the 567 adults read 16 statements from the original list again, and 16 new statements that they hadn't read before. The participants were asked to rate the accuracy of the statements on a 7-point scale, ranging from 1 being definitely false to 7 being definitely true. When tested immediately, the new statements they hadn't read before scored an average of 4.12 on the chart. That's a value right in the middle, and that value isn't surprising because the items were selected so that most people wouldn't know whether it was true or false, so a middle value makes sense. However, the statements that had been shown to the participants before and repeatedly, well, they were rated at 0.68 points higher than the new items. Dan found that simply reading the same statement once before shifted the participants' later belief in it. People believed it more, and that effect lasted for over a month. Making something familiar makes it more believable, and scammers have used this to influence political elections.
Yeah, so this is a case of a Florida election in which a couple of what I would call scammers ran ghost candidates to try and take away votes from the real candidates. So there was a candidate in this election named Rodriguez, and people recruited somebody named Alex Rodriguez, not related to the baseball player, but with the same last name, to run against that person in a primary, right? And the reason for doing that is to take advantage of the fact that the name was familiar and to try and take votes away from the actual candidate on the grounds that people would say, oh, yeah, Rodriguez, and just vote for that person. What this election campaign was doing by running ghost candidates is very much like what's known as the same name scam. You use a familiar name for something to make it seem more appealing to other people. And this has a long history. There was a political figure named Lyndon LaRouche, who was prominent in the 1970s, kind of a right-wing movement, somewhat cult-like, somewhat like some current presidential campaigns. And it was an interesting campaign because in Illinois, in a primary, they ran, in the Democratic primary, they ran several candidates who were supporters of LaRouche, who were running against people who had what would at that point be described as more ethnic sounding names. But the candidates that they ran instead were, very sort of American sounding names like, Janice Hart or Mark Fairchild. But they were running against people like Aurelia Puczynski and George Sangmeister. And it turns out that a couple of them actually snuck through in the primaries because people would vote because the name sounded familiar.
Marketers use this same familiarity bias to cause trust and recognition with customers. Companies like Ralph Lauren give their jeans the familiar name Hampton. IKEA name their bookcases Billy. The self-driving truck firm uses the name Nikola, linking itself to the famous engineer Nikola Tesla and, of course, to Musk's car company. And I even named this podcast Nudge to benefit from familiarity with nudge theory and Valorant Sunstein's famous book. Familiarity is powerful, but scammers can use it in unethical ways.
Joe Lowe used the same name scam to a degree by naming one of his companies Blackstone to try and draw the parallel. We assume, we don't know the motivations. We don't know exactly why he was doing it, but there's a chance that naming it something like Blackstone might lead banks not to check as thoroughly because they would assume that they were dealing with Blackstone, the well-known financial institution, and not his knockoff of it. That's a common sort of tactic. It makes people kind of more trusting because it sounds familiar, right? So if you have a company that's named something similar to a standard company, it's going to lead people to be more trusting of it. That's why you can end up with tons of pizza chains, pizza restaurants, all with very similar names, because which one is the real one?
In New York City, there were once dozens of Ray's famous original pizza restaurants. None of them were related to one another. There are over 500 pubs in the UK named Red Lion. This familiarity influences us. Political scientists Cindy Cam and Elizabeth Zeichmeister compared voters' relative preferences for two fictitious candidates, Mike Williams and Ben Griffin. Williams is a more common last name, and it was the answer listed first under the question, for which candidate would you vote? 2/3 of the participants chose Williams when given no additional information, a result consistent with research showing that familiar names have an advantage due to the familiarity principle. Research like this also helps explain why yard signs and banners proliferate before American elections. They mostly signal preferences and affiliation, but they can also boost support for a candidate by increasing the candidate's familiarity. Field experiments in which yard signs are placed at random have shown that they do have a small casual influence, shifting the vote share by about 1.7 percentage points on average. Scammers will make their ideas, their companies, and their staff sound familiar to persuade and convince us. But familiarity and consistency aren't all they use. Precision is another tool in the fraudsters' arsenal that is particularly good at persuading.
Precision is the idea that we really favor detail. We really favor information that's exact, that's precise. And there's a good reason for that. Again, most of the time, if people have a really deep understanding, let's say you're a scientist and you have a really deep understanding of some principle, you have a really good model of it, you're going to be able to make predictions that are precise, that are going to go to more decimal places. If you're a good weather forecaster, you have a really good model, you're going to have a pretty good idea of the chance that a region is going to experience rain and when. Right? If you're a good hurricane modeler, you're going to have a pretty good guess a day out of exactly where this is going to hit and how strong it's going to be, because you have a good understanding at that point. And that sort of precision is really appealing. We tend to see precision and make the inference that the understanding is good as a result. That's usually a really good heuristic to have, that precise information typically will correspond to a better understanding. People who are looking to deceive us also know that. If you give people more precise information, it makes them more accepting of it because it seems somehow more true or seems to reflect a better understanding. This has been well known in advertising for decades, right? I mean, there's a reason that Ivory described their soap as 99 and 33, I forget what the exact ratio is, percent pure, right? 99 and 44/100% pure. And I don't even know what that means or how pure it should be, right? Those are questions that you should ask there, but giving that precise number somehow makes it seem like it's more true, that there's more value to it. And this sort of precision of estimate, we often don't think about where did that precision come from? Was there really enough data to know that? And what sort of measurement scale were they actually using? What sort of measurement device were they actually using? Was it sensitive enough to even pick that up? We encounter this quite a bit in science where you get this sort of false precision. So I study response times in a lot of studies, right, where we just measure how quickly somebody can respond to something, and we can measure that in milliseconds. But you'll sometimes see average responses given in fractions of a millisecond. Like, well, that doesn't make sense because you can't measure it that precisely. And even if you could, it wouldn't matter at that level. It's like giving a percentage. You measure 100 people and you give a percentage down to, decimal places, or it's just not really that useful. It doesn't tell you anything more than about the information you have. But the result is that we treat it as somehow reflecting a better understanding.
Dan has a great example of how precision is used to persuade in his book. On May 25, 2021, Rand Paul took the floor of the US Senate to argue for a 10% cut in the National Science Foundation's annual budget. That's NSF in short.
And we say we're going to combat China through this bill, but we're going to combat China by increasing a department of government, the National Science Foundation, that is actually probably one of the most wasteful agencies in government.
To make his point, Rand decided to use precision.
I love the example of Rand Paul giving congressional testimony where he's trying to argue for massive cuts to the NSF, National Science Foundation, the main funding of basic science in the United States. And he repeatedly showed a poster that was looking at quails and dosing them with cocaine to look at their reproductive behavior. Every time he presented it, the amount of money involved was different. It would change, but it was given down to the penny, basically. In one point, he actually gave a number with so much precision that he accidentally used the footnote number from a report as part of the actual amount of money that was provided. It was a nice example because when you're making this case, you've got this poster, it's got this really concrete number. Here is the exact amount of money that went to this study of cocaine use and sexual behavior in quail. It looks ridiculous. You can make fun of it, even though it wasn't a ridiculous study on its own. And then use that to cut a specific amount, propose cuts of a specific amount from an agency. So he was proposing a 10% cut to the NSF, which would have been millions of dollars, orders of magnitude more than that one grant. But it makes a really compelling case, and we don't think about, 10%, that doesn't sound big, but $700,000 sounds huge, right? And that 10% is orders of magnitude more than the $700,000. But by giving a really precise number, we lose track of that. We don't think about the details. We tend to think that number, I can find other things I could do for that exact amount of money. But 10% of some big number that I don't know, I don't know what that means.
Rand Paul's poster shared how $356,933, $100,000 and 140 cents had been spent on a study on quails. This extremely precise number is used on purpose. It captures attention and persuades. Studies prove this. One 2023 study in the Journal of Consumer Psychology looked at how rounding up a price discount reduced sales. Researchers found that precise discounts are 18% more effective than rounded discounts. A discount of, say, $15.23 will increase purchase intention by 18% compared to a higher, non-precise discount of $16. $16 is more than $15.23, but it's less effective as a discount because it's less precise. As a part of a series of 4 experiments, the researchers found that when people were shown a precise versus a rounded discount, they were 13.3% more likely to say they would buy a hard drive, 11.4% to say they were more likely to buy a cooler, and 17.7% to say they were more likely to buy a water bottle. Precise numbers work. Rand Paul knows it, and so does your local gas station.
We tend to have this reaction a lot. When we have precise detail, we don't think about the relative amounts of money involved. Like one of my favorite examples of this is gasoline prices. People make a huge deal about gasoline prices, whether it goes up by 20 cents or not, or 25 cents in different locations. But what we don't think about is that for most people, the cost of insuring your car for a year is a lot more than the cost of gasoline. So even if it goes up by 25 cents, that's trivial in comparison to the insurance costs. So we don't think about those relative costs and the relative value of that. We don't think about, hey, you could save 10 cents per gallon if you get a car wash. Like, well, great. Okay, so that's 10 cents per gallon. You get 10 gallons of gas. That's $1. And the car wash costs $10. So that's not necessarily a great deal. But we don't think about it because we see that concrete number right in front of us.
Seeing an extremely precise number should raise alarm bells. You should question it. Is it real, or is it just being used to persuade you? It's not just visible in political speeches and gas stations, but also in scientific research.
And this plays out in research all the time. Right? We talk about an example in the book of a claim about how much positive versus negative experiences or emotions lead to changes in sort of happiness. There was a prominent book and study published talking about the positivity ratio. And the claim was that people who experience a ratio of more than 2.9013 positive events for each negative event thrive. Right? Well, think about how much data you would need to know that it was 2.9013 as opposed to 2.9014. There's no way that any study in psychology could do that. Right? We don't get that level of precision. In some areas of physics, you get that level of precision, but not in a measurement of happiness and positive experience, whatever those are, right, in this context. So that should have been a sign of, there's a problem here. Right? You shouldn't be making a claim like this. You might be able to make a claim of maybe about 3 plus or minus some, right? But 2.9013 should have been a red flag. But instead, it gets published in top journals, right? Because that precision is translated into a belief in a deeper understanding when there actually wasn't one. And Nick Brown and Alan Sokol and colleagues took that apart by looking at the model that was used to generate that number. And it was a completely nonsensical model in this context. It was a model of fluid dynamics, not of happiness and positive experiences. And it was using default settings that had nothing to do with what was actually relevant here. That aspect of the paper was eventually retracted. The modeling was actually eventually retracted because it was nonsensical. But it took years. And in the meantime, that became a really prominent perspective, that thinking about a critical ratio, literally defined as a critical ratio, implying that there's something really concrete and meaningful about it, was somehow valuable. Whereas a paper saying, hey, if you have more positive experiences than negative ones, you'll generally be happier, probably wouldn't have made waves.
Those positivity ratio researchers knew their paper would be more persuasive if they gave it a ridiculously precise number. Perhaps they knew this because they had read Kimiko Yamahashi's work. Yamahashi asked students to evaluate the risk of 11 causes of death, such as homicide, pneumonia, and cancer. Before making their judgment, they saw estimates of how many people died from each cause, either out of 100 people or out of 10,000 people. For example, they might see a death rate of 12.86 out of 100 people, or the equivalent, which is 1,286 people out of 10,000 people. Participants found all 11 causes riskier when the denominator was 10,000 rather than when it was 100, even though the death rates were of course identical. 12.86 is the same as 1,286, but when they saw the second version, they said the cause of death was riskier. In fact, even when the death rate was somewhat higher in the 100 condition than the 10,000 condition, such as 24.12 out of 100 or 1,286 out of 10,000, they still rated the death rates out of 10,000 as indicating greater risk. The participants were influenced by the size of the number. 1,286 is much larger than 24.12, and they didn't fully correct for the difference in the denominator. Precision is persuasive. Perhaps that's why personality tests like Myers-Briggs are so popular.
So, everybody knows the Myers-Briggs. It's used all over the place, and you get these categories. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? You get these letters associated with you. There's nothing inherently wrong with the sorts of questions that are used in the Myers-Briggs. There are better measures of personality, but they're basically mapping onto some of the standard measures of personality dimensions. The problem isn't so much measuring personality dimensions. It's dividing them into categories. And those category boundaries are arbitrary and not meaningful. People will cross those category boundaries if they retake it a few weeks later.
This is true. Dan, in his book, cites studies about this personality testing. They find that people who retake personality tests, like Myers-Briggs, will often have different results. This doesn't mean that they've absorbed different personalities after just a few weeks of retaking it. It just means that their answers on the second test differed by just enough, perhaps due to a change in mood, to push them across the sharp but arbitrary line dividing one type of personality to another.
The big issue, the fallacy there, comes in thinking about personality dimensions as if they were discrete categories and boundaries. That makes them feel more precise to say, I am an I, as opposed to an E. Somehow that feels more precise, but you're throwing away all of the information about gradations there. And those change. Those vary. You vary in how introverted and extroverted you are over time.
Myers-Briggs, gas station prices, and Rand Paul's arguments are more effective because they're precise. Precision, familiarity, and consistency are 3 cognitive habits that scammers use to manipulate us. But there's another bias that perhaps is more important than the rest. Let's hand back to Dan, who shares the final cognitive bias fraudsters use to persuade us. It's potency.
So potency is the idea that a simple thing can have a big consequence. And when that's true, it's really, really important. So we have examples of that in the world, right? Antibiotics had a massive effect on health in the world. Vaccines had a massive benefit in health in the world. A tiny little thing had a huge effect on mortality, eliminated diseases that had plagued us for decades or centuries. Those are small innovations. Of course, they took years to develop, but they're small innovations that have giant consequences. And we find those really appealing for good reason. Right? There's a reason why snake oil is so compelling. It's, hey, here's this simple, single thing that's going to cure all of our ills. That plays out in marketing too. So, hey, do this simple thing and it's going to double your productivity. Well, that's a claim about potency, that this small thing is going to have a giant effect. And in general, that doesn't happen. Right? It's a rare thing. When it does, it's valuable, but a lot of the time it doesn't. Small causes rarely lead to big effects, and complex problems almost always require complex solutions. But we like the quick fix. We like the simple change. There are a couple of questions you can kind of ask yourself whenever you're getting a pitch of this sort of, hey, this tiny little thing is going to have this big benefit. The thing I like to ask is, what's the active ingredient? Right? What is doing the work? The classic example of snake oil has a bad name. Snake oil salesmen don't, but snake oil got a bad name. There's actually some evidence that snake oil or snake venom can have some positive benefits for pain reduction, for example. The original snake oil was developed by a guy named Clark Stanley, who was known as the Rattlesnake King. He would go to like the Chicago World Fair and would market his snake oil that he claimed to have discovered from the Maki Indians as a treatment for everything. So he listed all of these amazing things, everything from poisoning to, gout to stomach problems to everything would be cured by this. And he marketed his snake oil. It was kind of a classic patent medicine of that era. And he eventually was fined by the precursor of the Federal Trade Commission now, or the FDA. Like, it didn't exist at the time. There wasn't any regulation prior to that, but they eventually did investigate him and found him guilty of deceptive advertising. Not for claiming that his stuff cured all these things, but because the bottles didn't actually contain any snake oil. So he was a snake oil salesman selling something that had no active ingredient at all, other than maybe alcohol, which all of those medicines did. But that's that sort of claim that, hey, this one thing is going to cure all of these ills, or this one simple thing is going to have gigantic effects, we find really appealing.
It's not just snake oil salesmen who use potency to persuade, it's scientific research as well. Dan shares examples in his book of incredibly impactful scientific studies that were based on alarmingly small sample sizes. Take a 2003 study with only 17 participants, which reported how playing first-person shooter games could improve the player's performance on cognitive tasks. It was published in Nature and cited 3,500 times. A TED Talk on it has 8 million views. Yet it has never been replicated. A meta-analysis of all follow-up studies show no link in first-person shooter games and improved cognition. Something as small as playing a video game probably won't change your cognitive ability. It's just not big enough of an intervention to have that effect. Yet these papers gain awareness because their findings are so potent.
But it also led to, I think, a lot of studies in an entire field of psychology, a subfield of psychology that had a huge amount of popularity, where these tiny little experimental manipulations had big effects, even though people were completely unaware that they even experienced them. And the implication is that all of these little things are having these huge influences on you. But if that were true, you have to think, what would be the consequence if this were true? What would happen if, whether or not you were holding a warm cup of coffee versus a cold cup of coffee, led you to change how you thought of other people's personalities? Right? Would that mean that when it's hot outside, you think people are nicer? Would you be more likely to make charitable donations in the summer than the winter? These effects are gigantic in these studies, but the consequences would be massive. You can think of it like if you could predict the future, right? If psychics really could do what they claim to do, they'd be making millions in casinos every day. But they don't, so that's probably not the case. We tend to think these small manipulations, like is the newscaster smiling when they're talking about one candidate versus another, can have these massive effects on whether or not people vote. Probably not, since billboards everywhere don't have a very big effect. There are studies claiming that briefly flashing a country's flag so fast that people don't report seeing it changes their voting behavior 2 weeks later. Right? There's no way. We see flags all the time, and whatever experience we have in that tiny little study is just going to be swamped by all of the experiences we have day to day. And those effects are so big that they're bigger than the effects of having tons of yard signs compared to not having any. Right? It just doesn't make sense.
Dan's replicated some of these questionable, potent, packed studies himself. He was always very wary of a 2008 study in Science that suggested how people who held a cup of coffee, a warm cup of coffee, rated their conversation partner as warmer than those who were chatting to people while holding a cold drink. So he tested it himself. He followed the procedures in both experiments as closely as possible, except that when he tested it, he used more than 3 times as many participants as the original test. He found virtually no effect. Holding something warm did not change what people thought of their conversation partner. Small inputs rarely lead to large outcomes. So next time you see a surprising result from a tiny implementation, question it. Ask yourself, if that were true, what would the implications be? Do those implications seem believable or bogus? That is one tactic to use when spotting potency. But what about the other cognitive biases fraudsters use, such as consistency, familiarity, and precision? How can we spot when they're being used to manipulate us? Well, Dan has some advice, starting with consistency.
So one thing we noticed across all of these areas is that when somebody is caught for a scam, and you look at their history, they almost always have scammed before. And in many cases, people who are committing these frauds have actually been convicted of fraud before, which to me is a sign that maybe people aren't doing their due diligence enough when there's something that's big at stake. There's a relatively recent example of an Orlando art museum exhibiting a collection of Basquiat drawings that were discovered, right? And you always should worry when there's a discovery of incredibly valuable paintings in some warehouse someplace. But the implication now is that those are probably all faked. And there's some suggestions that if you just look at the forensics, some of them were on cardboard boxes, which is not out of character. But one of them was on a FedEx box. But the logo on the FedEx box was from after Basquiat had died. So that's a problem. It can't probably be a genuine Basquiat if it was painted on something that didn't exist yet. But the people who were involved in that, pretty much all of the people who discovered these Basquiats, if you look at their past, they almost all had convictions for something, right? Often fraud.
Fraudsters are consistent themselves. If they are committing fraud, it's likely that they've done it before. But what about familiarity? How can we combat that?
Making the familiar seem strange, right? Getting rid of the names. We're in the middle of a heated election season, as always. And one of the things you can do to kind of see whose policies really fit your beliefs is to try and give the policy information without knowing who the candidates are. Mask the candidate information and then evaluate how much do I agree with these beliefs. And that gets rid of the sort of familiarity of the candidate and gets to the policy more directly. But we can do that for decisions of many sorts, where we take away the information that's familiar to us, leaving just the content, and then evaluate it. That kind of overrides this sort of tendency to rely on that gut feeling of, yes, this is familiar, this is good.
And finally, precision. How can we stop fraudsters from using that bias to manipulate us?
Small things don't tend to lead to big outcomes. I think that's one way to think about this is the vast majority of those cases where people say, you can double your memory, or you can increase your productivity. The vast majority of those have no evidence backing them at all, let alone 10 times. And think about how much evidence you would need to show that it's 10 times or 3.6 times as opposed to 3.7 or 11. A lot of that's sort of advertising puffery, but we should also think about it. If it is, throw out the precision of that number and assume that it's just maybe slightly more at best. I have seen a ton of scams, a ton of products promoted for which there is actually very little, if any, evidence making these claims of 2 times or 3 times or 10 times. It's sometimes funny if you look at these websites, a site that will claim to 10x your productivity. If you look elsewhere on the site, that'll say 7x. Some other places, it'll say 3.5x. It's not even consistent internally, but they make the same sorts of claims.
Dan writes how people treat precision as a sign of rigor and realism. People treat vagueness as a sign of evasion. When given concrete, detailed information, we tend to assume it must be accurate and well-researched. Often, this assumption is accurate, but all too often, it's used by fraudsters to scam. Consistency, familiarity, potency, and precision are 4 cognitive habits used to manipulate. Marketers use them to sell more, Madoff used them to grow his Ponzi scheme, and Rand Paul used them to persuade Congress. But be wary, as it's very likely someone is using them to manipulate you. Okay, folks, that is all for this week's episode of Nudge. Big thank you to Dan Simons for coming on. His book is fantastic. I'd highly recommend it. There are a few incredibly small nuggets of information in there that have honestly changed my life. I think you'll love that book too, so I've left a link to it in the show notes. Now, I know you are familiar with the Nudge newsletter. 6,421 of you have already subscribed, but there's still thousands of you who don't, and this puzzles me. You're listening to this show, so you obviously like behavioral science, so why not subscribe? Each week I spend 18 hours turning the best marketing psychology I've found into easy-to-read Friday newsletters. If you like this show, you'll love the newsletter, so just head to nudgepodcast.com and click newsletter in the menu to subscribe. That's all from me, your host, Phil Agnew. I'll be back next Monday with another episode of Nudge. Oh, and hopefully you've just spotted how I used all 4 of Dan's cognitive biases in that outro to attempt to persuade you. And if you haven't spotted them, well, then you might want to go back and listen to the podcast again. All right, that's all from me. Bye-bye.